So welcome, everybody. It's a little bit after 6. I'm Magda Teter. I'm the Schindler Chair in Judaic Studies here at Fordham University and the co-director of the Center for Jewish Studies. And I'm really pleased to welcome you today for one of our events in the Black Studies and Jewish Studies in Conversation series, which Wes, my colleague, and I started in 2021. And I'm really delighted to welcome you to today's panel, which is an all-star panel of leaders in public history. So I'm really very excited about it. When we planned today's event, it was a long time ago, it was a different world. It was to follow a conversation about memory, heritage, and material remains with Professors Ana Lucia Araujo from Howard University and Yechiel Weizmann from Bar Ilan University in Israel. But the geopolitical crisis intervened and Yechiel couldn't join us from Israel. We meet today to discuss the role of museums and public history play in society, especially in dealing with difficult past. The past does not change, but the narratives we tell ourselves about the past do, as do the ways the past is told. While scholars typically write books, we rely on public historians and museums to translate the scholarship for a broader public. Museums then play an important role not only in the shaping of public's understanding of history, but also in fashioning public conversations and cultural change. With history contested both in the United States and in other countries, this panel of distinguished visionaries and leaders of public history will discuss what museums and public history mean in the current moment, addressing questions about shared past but divided present, both in the United States and in Europe. Museums and public history can not only challenge and the predominant perspective, but also introduce new voices and bridge conflicting and clashing versions of history. We call this session Shared Past, Divided Present. The speakers today have experience with addressing difficult past through public history, offering a perspective on historical events that occurred a long time ago, but that continue to have a presence now in collective memory, identity, and imagination. Perhaps our conversation will also offer a lens and tools with which we can begin to process the events we are witnessing in our own moment, though certainly without the perspective afforded by a distance of time. Now, let me introduce our distinguished panelists. Christy Coleman has, in the middle, has served as the CEO of some of the nation's most prominent museums. She's an innovator and leader with more than 30 years of experience in museums and public history. Christy held leadership roles at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, the Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History in Detroit, and the incredible American Civil War Museum in Richmond, Virginia. She now serves as the executive director of the Jamestown Yorktown Foundation. She's a tireless advocate for the power of museums, narrative correction, diversity, and inclusiveness. Christy Coleman is the recipient of numerous awards for her decades of impact, including 3 honorary doctorates from the College of William and Mary, Virginia Commonwealth University, and the University of the South, and numerous other awards. In 2018, Time Magazine named her one of the 31 people changing the South. In 2019, Worth Magazine named her one of the women changing the world. And she has been a featured guest on many news and television outlets, including the History Channel's Grant and Lincoln, Divided We Stand miniseries, Black Patriots, Civil War Heroes, Neutral Ground, and When the Monuments Came Down. Erica Lehrer, over there, is a sociocultural anthropologist and curator. She's presently a professor in the departments of history and sociology and anthropology at Concordia University in Montreal, and a founding director of the university's curating and public scholarship lab. From 2007 and to 2017, she held the Canada Research Chair in Museum and Heritage Studies, and she currently directs the international team projects thinking through the museum partnership approaches to curating difficult knowledge in public, which is founded by the Canadian Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. She's the author of, and editor of several books, including Lucky Jews, and this is the book she did speak here at Fordham a few years ago about, which is based on an exhibit she curated in Krakow, Poland. Jewish Poland Revisited, Heritage Tourism in unique places, and Curatorial Dreams, Critics Imagine Exhibitions. Annie Polland, to my left, is the president of the Tenement Museum in New York City. She's a historian and a leader of public history and really a trailblazer. We know each other from grad school, and she had the courage to go right to the public history. So she really is a trailblazer. In her published work, she has focused on the history of New York, in particular its Jewish population. And before becoming the president of the Tenement Museum, Annie was the executive director of the American Jewish Historical Society, and prior to that, the executive vice president of programs and education at the Tenement Museum and other institutions. She has been engaged in public history for decades, deploying storytelling to amplify the experiences of immigrants and migrants. Some of her books draw directly from her experience as a public historian, immersed in the materiality of historical remains. She's the author of Landmark of the Spirit, the Eldridge Street Synagogue, and with our own colleague, Daniel Sawyer, Emerging Metropolis, New York Jews in the Age of Immigration, 1840-1920. Co-moderating with me will be my colleague, Wes Alcenat, over there. For the past 3 years, we have team taught a class on anti-Semitism and racism, and curated an exhibition on the topic confronting hate, anti-Semitism, racism, and the resistance, which was on at Fordham last year. Wes is a historian of the 19th century U.S. and the Caribbean. His scholarship covers the shared histories of African Americans, the African diaspora, and in the Atlantic world. He's currently working on a book on Prince Saunders, Haitian immigration and questions of citizenship, which explores the radicalism and ideologies of African American settlers who emigrated to Haiti in the 19th century. Wes's academic interests have intersected with public history and equity in higher education. And I just want to express my thanks to so many of you who are here and online for coming, but also this program, as all our public programs, are possible thanks to the generosity of so many friends of the center, the members of the advisory board, the Schindler Gift Fund to Fordham University, the generosity of Fordham trustees, Henry Miller and Dario Warnheim, and several anonymous donors and individuals without whose support we couldn't offer these stimulating programs. And I also want to thank, and I don't know where she is, but Siobhan Verletza, who does everything that makes these events happen in real life. So thank you very much for coming, and now let's get us started.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I think it's fair to say that for the better part of a decade now, can you all hear me? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think for the better part of a decade now, public history has been very much in our consciousness. And I'm thinking specifically to the moment, it might have been 2016, when you had that far-right protest in Charlottesville. 2017. Was it 2017? And it actually really overlaps with exactly the kind of conversation we're trying to have today in terms of some of the vile words and ideas and perception and hateful ideologies that were expressed. If you, I don't know if many of you remembered, but not only was the history of the U.S. with regards to African-American history, the Civil War, and more broadly, and contestation at that moment. Also, if you remembered, some of the protesters had said, Jews will not replace us, thus linking these two sort of histories together. So, so for many of you, given that you work in public history, you all come through this from different paths and different experiences and approaches. Can each one of you tell us a bit about your own work in public history and how you come to understand the role of public history plays in society and how your work has played a part in fashioning public conversations about those histories in terms of reckoning with the past?
Okay. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. Well, I guess I should start, but well, first of all, thank you so much for having me here. And I really feel honored to be in this august group. I should say I'm not an historian, even though I teach in a history department. I'm actually a cultural anthropologist, and I think that's relevant. And in fact, when I maybe later talk a little bit more about my curatorial work, I'm not exactly addressing sort of like I'm not trying to exhibit history per se. I'm trying to sort of think through some of these concepts that that are so important in how we think about history. The categories that we think with, the stories, the concepts, the objects as well. So that's just like a little bit of a caveat. I maybe just wanted to start by saying a little bit about how I maybe got to think about public history, and I think that happened beginning in graduate school at the very end of my PhD in cultural anthropology, when a new museum studies program cropped up at the University of Michigan, and I jumped at the chance. And through that, I actually learned about some amazing, what I now think of as public history projects, including the Lower East Side Tenement Museum. This was a moment when sort of new museology was kind of coming onto the scene, sort of early 2000s. And that was like held up as this amazing example. But at the same time, I encountered another sort of angle into this, which are artists who were doing so-called interventions into museums to sort of try to prompt museums that were maybe not so innovative to kind of use the museum's own like technologies to create a form of sort of self-criticism, or to get publics to engage critically with museums. So yeah, I mean, those were kind of like maybe my inspirations for like what public history could do. I'm thinking particularly of Fred Wilson, who's like this generation-defining African-American artist who did a really important intervention in the Baltimore Historical Society, I think in 1992, digging out artifacts that had never been shown. So this is a city with like majority Black population. There had never been an exhibition in this historical society, either about African-American history or about slavery. And like digging out the slave shackles that they had and putting them next to these beautiful, Ray-Poussé silver, kind of objects, just to, and really asking hard questions. So that was sort of like my sense of like, oh my gosh, this is how you can get at, this is how an anthropologist maybe could get at public history. But then of course my own work unfolded in Poland, because that's where I did my work. And in Poland, in Poland, you had essentially, a couple of decades of incredibly inspiring truth-telling, right after communism ended. So, last, say, 20, 30 years, and then replaced starting in 2015 by a really right-wing conservative government who started using museums and heritage as tools for very regressive right-wing statecraft, promoting like what's called a pedagogy of pride, and, against a pedagogy of shame, and trying not to discuss any of the difficult issues. So my work, in short, has been to try to create spaces along with many more very inspiring Polish culture workers to try to create space for independent culture, and space where you can ask hard questions, including of the institutions that are supposed to be telling us about our culture and history. So.
I have one. They gave me, I have the lab. which is why they put me in the middle, because so for me, the intersection and the work, I recognize that my entree into the field is very different from many of my peers. And granted, people in museum work in particular, we come at it from a lot of different disciplines. So first of all, but mine was probably the most unusual, and it links to something that you just said. I actually got my first museum job at 17 as an actor. I had been hired as an actor at Colonial Williamsburg to portray a person of the past. And that was an extraordinary thing, let me tell you. Predominantly because, so fast forward all of these years, you know, from that summer gig through college, and then grappling with whether or not that was a career I wanted to pursue, because there is no money in it, or at least there wasn't at the time. But I just really, I was torn about what I wanted to do for a variety of reasons. However, that said, because I entered the museum world through the power of narrative, and the power and what that did, and the power of empathy in our museum spaces, I realized just how powerful it really could be. Most practitioners make the mistake, in my view, of putting forth this false notion that they're somehow objective. Museum exhibitry has never been objective. And in fact, we are suffering, in my view, because of the way we have portrayed our past. And then over time, and the different work and things that I've done over the years, and sort of pushing the envelope, I'll give you an example of how past can play a trick on your brain. Because history really has never been for the dead, right? It's for the living. It's the way that we connect to each other, our communities, our state, nation states, whatever. So I mentioned Williamsburg at 17. I'm not going to tell you how many years ago that was, but it was a long time ago. And Williamsburg, on the eve of the American Revolution, it was the capital city of the wealthiest of the 13 colonies. Its wealth was far beyond the other colonies. But this capital city of the wealthiest of the 13 colonies was 52% Black. Now, if you visit Colonial Williamsburg at any given point in time over the past 100 years, and they will be celebrating their 100th birthday in 2026, you wouldn't know that. Generally, you wouldn't, because it's not visual to you. They have done a lot of work over the decades of bringing that to the fore, but the visual vernacular of that space is fife and drums and pretty dresses and, you know, Thomas Jefferson and the speakers and, you know, because it is unintentionally reinforced by the way we think about our past. Okay. And so I'm going to wrap this up really quick, because there's what I like to say to people, and what I've really come to understand is, for those of us in the public history space, and museums in particular, if we are not consciously aware that we are constantly navigating three key elements, the International Sites of Conscience has 4 others, but there are really 3 in my mind. 3 key elements are at play all the time. There's the history, which is the forensic. There's the actual history, the forensic, that's constantly being reevaluated, that's constantly being thought about, that's constantly being asked new questions of what exists, finding new methodologies, pedagogies, you name it. That's history. Then there's heritage. And heritage is that piece that's far trickier, because heritage is how the dominant cultures of a community chooses to define itself. It is the negotiated past, which is often why that negotiated past doesn't include those things that are less comfortable. Or we place in those spaces this idea that if one more person says to me, well, you know, what Jefferson did was, in writing the Declaration of Independence is far more important than the fact that he owned 600 people and had 6 children with this enslaved woman. They're not in contradiction. He is all of those things. And if you understand that he's all of those things, and it just makes it so much more, he's incredibly fascinating to me. Always will be incredibly fascinating to me. And then the last part of this is memory. And memory is in cities, because we all remember it different, right? And the problem is, when it comes to the heritage making, we often rely on memory, which is how we got that, part of the reason of how we got that lost cause nonsense. And so, like I said, I came into it with a theater and an understanding of narrative. I evolved to understand it through these three lenses. And so my work has been about always creating new memories that are built on the forensic for my visitor, so that they can themselves choose to change their heritage narrative. And so I am actively doing that all the time. I am actively trying to reinforce the importance of revisiting that heritage narrative from the forensic. I mean, these things are working all the time. Sometimes I will use their heritage making to help them transition. I mean, we have a lot of different tools, and I think that that's part of the reason why we can challenge the norm and people don't lose their minds, even though it is radically different in those spaces, just like what you've done. What you've done at the Tenement is just, it's one of my favorite museums in the world, because it's a conversation in the space that just is ongoing about a city that continues to evolve, right? So,
Yeah, wow.
So
there you go.
I am going to speak very minimally, because I really just want to listen to my co-panelists and get inspired by their work and ideas. But I love what you're saying about conversation. And we just did one of the things that's so hard to deal with history in this world, because one of the things as an executive director, my primary responsibility is actually to raise money so that the organization can function. But my training is in history, and I would never be able to raise money if I didn't love the history and that dynamic. But all I want to do really is talk about the history. So I'm excited to be here. But I think that so because when you're trying to raise money for something, you have to give evidence. Foundations want to see this has this impact, and all the social service people can be like, we raised X number of money, we fed 900 people, they are all in jobs now, they can do this kind of work. But when you deal with history, you deal with the humanities, how do you measure your impact? So we have to bring in people to talk to people after and try to get a sense. And I think one of the things that heartened me the most was that someone said after that in a focus group, I had never been to a museum where the exhibit was the conversation, or the conversation was the exhibit. The idea that history or what you're learning at a museum is not static. It's not something that is just text on a wall that you're going to read and then memorize, just like, a textbook isn't something that is history, but history is rather how we grapple with it, the dynamic of us grappling with that and figuring out how to unpack how our view of history is shaped by heritage, is shaped by memory, and how do we detangle those things. And I think one of the things I found in public history is that everyone has everyone wants to do that. And sometimes I've seen more curiosity and more excitement and more innovation coming from people who are not quote unquote historians, but rather people living in society wanting to make sense of what that society is. So I think, being able, I think one way of thinking about the work that I do is also comes from these conversations at the museum. And one of the things people often say is, I thought history was a textbook, right? I thought history was this textbook thing. And I think what we want to do is bring it to life for people. And I think theater and narrative is one of the ways to do that, but apply all different kinds of ways to bring people into that conversation and figure out what history is, because real history is constantly being made as people apply new questions. And I think one of my biggest goals is to say, like, how do we take a question a visitor asks on a tour, bring it back to a scholar, and have that become a new book, have that become a new way of researching. So I think that, like, putting different people in dialogue and understanding that the public has questions that need to be answered and that can motivate us is important. And then the exhibit that we're going to be opening in December is about a Black family that lived in the tenements. And the tour came about because we had been telling the story of an Irish family who lived in the tenements, whose name, it was Joseph and Bridget Moore, and we passed out a city directory to our visitors. And all of our tours are educator-led, meaning there's a guide who is bringing you through this immersive space, showing you objects, showing you primary sources, you know, trying to engage in conversation. And we would pass out this primary source of a city directory that located Joseph Moore. It said waiter, 97 Orchard Street. 97 Orchard Street is our address, right? So we're rooting him here. See, we didn't make this up. And then, but what people started to notice was directly above him was another Joseph Moore, also a waiter, right? So you have two men, same name in the city at the same time, but next to his name was a parentheses, COL''D. And so people asked in curiosity, genuine curiosity, what does that mean? What is cold? What is that? Oh, it is the abbreviation for the term colored, which was the term used in the 19th century to refer to Black people. And the question then too, that pops up, wait a minute, why isn't there anything next to Joseph P. Moore? It doesn't say IR next to him, right? And under you know, Joseph Levine, it doesn't say JW. Like, why is there a marker for that? And that became the kind of inspiration for us to research this Joseph Moore, who didn't live in our building. So it was a disruption from our methodology, but we went to, and we found out way more about Joseph and Rachel Moore, the Black family who lived in a neighborhood, what's now Soho, which is now actually where the Soho Grand Hotel is, and they're not telling his story. So we're like, we're gonna tell his story. And Wes has helped us to tell his story. And so that kind of, you know, our exhibit came from a visitor question and this idea of a conversation. I think that's one of the things we want to do, is bring people into conversation, not just so that the public learns history, but so scholars and museum makers are able to address questions and bring things to life in new ways.
So Christy, I want to follow up on what you said. So
Okay.
you worked in you work on what might be the most contested aspect of American history. And the American Civil War. You've worked on in the incredible, what I think is one of the best historic museums, the Museum of the American Civil War in Richmond, once the capital of Confederate States. You were also the co-chair of the Richmond Monument Avenue Commission, and were among the moderators and of this very, very contentious debate surrounding how to remove or replace the monuments that memorialize the lost cause. Can you tell us more about the work and how you were navigating this, what you mentioned, the treacherous triad of history, heritage, and memory in those spaces?
Yeah, so there are a couple important precursors to that. The first being is that the Commonwealth of Virginia established a statewide commission to commemorate the sesquicentennial of the American Civil War. And it was going to, well, it ran from, it was supposed to just run from 2011 through 2015. But there were those of us who said, wait a minute, you can't just battle jump. This is a much bigger conversation. And for those of us in Richmond, we decided, we being the academic and the cultural community got together and said, we do not want this to be another 100th anniversary where it's just a bunch of people running around in gray and blue uniforms and you know, and no longer do we want this city to be solely defined by this moniker, which was deliberate, by the way. After Gone with the Wind, Richmond decided to sell itself as the capital of the Confederacy. I mean, it was certainly, but they decided to sell it as a marketing tool in the 40s and very aggressively did that. And so we couldn't shake it. I mean, we had Monument Avenue before then, obviously, but I mean, it was just, so there's a lot of history that we had to bump up against. But we decided in Richmond that it was not just going to be the sesquicentennial of the Civil War, but rather the sesquicentennial of Civil War and emancipation. And then we started putting together a series of programs and conversations in our community around that. And when I say conversations, I mean hard conversations that started from where people are and then linked it backwards. You know, we connected the tissues of why there are certain things, you know, are the way they are in Richmond, why Richmond's boundaries are actually physically different because of two really important constitutional changes that were made in 1905, and another set that was done even before that, and then another set. I mean, there were these moments where Richmond bent over backwards to try to preserve a certain status quo and racial hierarchy. One of the most compelling things white businessmen told me when I first went to that city for that job, because let me tell you, that was like the conundrum right there. Everybody was like, how in the hell and what is going on? Because the Civil War in Virginia, and quite frankly, most of the nation, when you think Civil War, most people just think Confederacy, which means they won the narrative war. Yeah. Like the North was like, we won, we're done. The South was like, we lost, but guess what? You know, they won the narrative. And so me as a Black woman stepping into this space, Black folk didn't know what to make of me, especially since I was coming out of Detroit, right? That was like, wait, what? Right? Knowing where I was. And white folks were just really stunned. But this white businessman said to me, one thing you have to understand about Richmond as you go about this work, and that is that it was built on two lies. The first lie was slavery was good for Black people, and the second lie was tobacco won't kill you. And so, so coming from that perspective, I decided to use humor to help in this process. And quite frankly, to claim the Civil War as mine. As a Black woman, this belongs to me. It isn't just the purview of white men, of wealthy white Virginia men, who one of my business peers literally was the great grandson of a Confederate general, and he himself had been a member of the Sons of Confederate Veterans and so forth and so on. And I mean, I was constantly in this space and having conversations with these folks about, well, you know, I'll never forget, you know, the lovely little white lady who said, well, you know, and decided to try to tell me about what a loving and wonderful relationship she had and one time with the Black woman that took care of her as a child, and her mother had taken care of her daddy, and this Black woman's grandmother had taken care of the other family in slavery. So she had 3 generations of this family connected to hers, and how much they loved each other and yada, 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 yada. And I said, that's really interesting. I said, so while she was looking after you, who was looking after their kids? And was that ever important to you? Or who was making sure they had an education? Or who was making sure that the choices? I mean, and I'm asking this woman, and she was in her 80s, and it probably wasn't fair, but I was asking her anyway. She's not stupid. She's grown up in this world like the rest of us. And the fact that it never occurred to her in and of itself. So it's that kind of thing that I, again, always bring back to the work. And I know it sounds like I'm off from the question, but it's all connected, because these were the conversations we started having around the city of Richmond. And we did them facilitated conversations, not like whiteboards, but just what are we going to talk about today? Oh, we want to talk about redlining. Well, there is a history to that. Oh, we want to talk about why the projects were built over there. Great. There's a connection to the Civil War with that. And we did that all over the city with mixed audiences in neighborhoods. And when the commission got started, because we had that shitstorm, because we had the crazy first meeting with 500 people trying to, it was very organized, the pros and the cons of taking the monuments down. And, everybody was really organized for that first meeting to come in full force and like push their particular agenda. And nobody came to listen. And it turned into just this massive thing. And that literally happened 3 days before the Charlottesville incident. That's what happened in Richmond. And it freaked people out completely. And we decided no more mass groups. We're going to go out 2 by 2 like the disciples. And we're going to go into communities, and we're going to, if we can keep the groups intimate, they're more likely to hear each other. And that is what worked for us, and made such a huge difference. And so by the time the commission made its recommendations, and we made 4, all 4 came to pass. Not the way that we said, but the way we suggested, but all 4 happened. So for example, we suggested getting with artists to reimagine what those statues could look like, right? Since we couldn't take them down at that point, because of a Virginia law that was specifically put in place to protect them, right? Back in 1905. There's a law that said you could not take down any war memorial or monument for the war between the states. And then it's just started adding on to that. It got up to the war in Iraq, I think it was. But it was always intended to protect Civil War monuments or Confederate monuments. Public or private lands. That was the law in Virginia. So we said, okay, artists recontextualize these things. Think about what they could be. Well, during the protests in the 2020, that's exactly what artists did. They started projecting images. There was spray painting, there were graffiti, and it became there's this iconic image of George Floyd being projected on Robert E. Lee's statue. That was on the cover of Time magazine. It is a stunning image. And they did that every night for a year. Different images with quotes until it came down. Absolutely stunning. Look it up. It's an amazing art thing. And it was done by local artists. It was not, again, this was organic. The community did this for themselves. The monuments were torn down because people wrapped the rope around them and pulled down Jefferson Davis, for example, which was the most insidious of them all, that particular monument. The commission also recommended that we put context signage on them, right, in the interim of this law. And community scholars and activists did just that. And they put up the history of the thing, of what was actually said during their dedication, what it has meant, and then quotes from contemporary people about how it made them feel. And they put these along the paths. And then the last piece that the commission recommended was that each of the larger localities should get together and lobby the state legislature for a change in the law. And they had a better shot, we knew, of getting it done under Democratic governor, getting it signed versus a Republican one. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened. The localities got together, and one by one they challenged in court, and they petitioned the legislature, and the legislature passed laws allowing localities to decide for themselves versus a statewide mandate. So localities are the ones who put them up in the first place. Localities should have the power to determine when it was time for them to come down. Right? And that was our suggestion. So it was an extraordinary adventure, to say the least. That is my public service for a while. because it was extraordinarily stressful, as you can imagine. But it was so necessary to talk to people and to have people actually listen to each other. So yeah, I don't, it's a lot. It's going in a book one day. I'm actually decided to go ahead and put together a book on museum practice, but through my career lens, obviously, versus, the statistics, and there's enough of that out there. I think I have a really interesting story to tell around this. So, look for that.
Yeah, and the power of the primary sources, that's what we also.
That was,
museum as well.
yeah, we put together that's the other thing, right? So we put together a partnering again with academics and with our museum peers, and we put together a website called On Monument Avenue, which just was a data dump of all of the archival materials and images and photographs and newspaper clippings around each and every one, so people could really understand exactly what was said at the time and what the histories were and who was in opposition to those. What people opposed them at the time. They thought it was outrageous that they were building these things, right? You would have never known that, right? So we built this website. That website within a week, which doesn't sound like a lot under the normal circumstances, but something that is that specific to a community of 200,000 people, and in the first week to have close to 20,000 visits on that website, and where they were spending on average 5 minutes on the website, that is huge for a website. And then the thing is, we kept seeing them repeat. They kept going back, looking. So these conversations were happening beyond us. And normally I wouldn't say that would work, but in that particular sense, it was the combination of factors that the community, was made aware of and made it happen. I promise not to talk so much the next time. I really do.
So, continue on this conversation about contested topics in history. If we sort of shift a little bit to Europe, right? And let me preface the question that I'm going to ask Erica on this. So, given that our conversation is about museums and public history, one thing that I was thinking about with regards to this specific forum that we have today, I was coming into it, is how sometimes the danger of museums is that history is frozen, at least in the public consciousness. And one thing that I remember, for instance, growing up, is how we memorialize the Holocaust, whether that be in film or in museums, and how Americans have often thought about it. And you would think that there is the Holocaust and there are Jews, but we don't know what is the history of anti-Semitism throughout Europe before that, and what does it look after that, right? But there's a way in which you freeze it here, and then when you have instances of anti-Semitic incidents that happen, then people are all shocked because the history is sort of like frozen. It's past but not present. And I think I remember reading the book Learning from the Germans, and one comment that she made about the way Americans often look at that history is everyone can tell you about how destructive and sad and terrible the Holocaust is, but no one can actually tell you some of the experiences that the people went through and what that meant. So I want to ask you if you could, Erica, if you could talk a bit about Jews and the Jewish past in public history and memory in Europe. So in places like Germany, Austria, France, and your experience in Eastern Europe, like Poland and Ukraine. So how does it look like there? And I would also kind of, on that, sort of ask if you may contrast that to how that same memory operates here in the US when you cross the Atlantic.
That's a very big question you just asked. Well, so drawing on something that you just said about, okay, everybody, whoever that is, say in Germany or wherever, knows about the sadness of the Holocaust, et cetera. But I think the thing is they don't know very much about Jews, about who the people were who were killed, even sort of, aside from the Holocaust and that experience. But so, so I guess thinking about Jewish history and heritage in Europe, maybe one thing I would say is that, there's been this incredible outpouring in the last, say, 30 years of, just incredible enthusiasm for rediscovering the Jewish past in Europe through, marking heritage sites, through creating festivals and lots of, food and music, building museums, redesignating like Jewish quarters. And this is the case from Portugal to Poland, right? And also on the Western side in Portugal and Spain, offering citizenship to people who can trace Sephardic roots, et cetera. Okay, maybe no longer. And that's all really wonderful. Although maybe I can talk a little bit maybe later about the sort of the limitations of that, particularly in the Polish version. So there's that. But then right, but then the question of then the Holocaust. So that's like the sort of the happy history, which is also, it's good, right? Because we want to know who were Jews, right? And what was lost. When you start thinking about the Holocaust, I think what's interesting in the contemporary moment is, how those discussions and how that memory sort of is both challenged and changes and gets re-energized based on what is going on at the moment, whether those are different discourses, whether there are new wars, and seeing, sort of you really get into the politics of memory. And maybe I guess there's sort of maybe two things sort of on my mind that I could mention. One is, in Germany right now, there is an incredibly important debate going on about sort of the ethics of German memory culture, sort of vis-a-vis, but not only the Holocaust. And it sort of has, there's this shorthand, a scholar wrote, Dirk Moses wrote an article called The German Catechism, and it's proposing this idea that there's a kind of, sacralized catechism, so a set of precepts of how one must remember the Holocaust, that in a sense kind of freeze this memory, and that there has to be one way to do it, and which makes the Germans look good because they're doing it right, and it also makes them feel very threatened to anybody who challenges that approach. And that approach also, has it has implications for both other kinds of racisms and events that are happening in the present moment, and it also has implications for other things that happened in the past. So I think the concern is that German Holocaust memory has sort of been frozen in this one appropriate way that that denies you can't compare the Holocaust to anything. So questions that have become really important lately in Europe, about questions about decolonization and about questioning colonial memory, and in this case, the first genocide of the 20th century in what was then Southwest Africa, so today's Namibia, of the Nama and Herero people by the Germans who were the colonists in that area. The idea that we can look at the Holocaust and colonialism in a single frame, and maybe identify some patterns of behavior, ways of enacting violence, ways of organizing populations, that you might be able to understand something more about both events, that sort of becomes anathema, or it becomes sacrilege if you have a sacralized way of approaching Holocaust memory. So that's something that's really, and in fact, I have to say, it's we're not going to be able to have this conversation without somehow mentioning what's going on in the present moment. And, just in the past week, I think this same kind of memory problematic has led to, if I can connect the dots, Palestinian culture workers, artists, scholars, authors who were supposed to present their books, their work in different places, have been, those events have been canceled. Those, speaking invitations have been pulled, because that also, in this moment, it's too threatening to this German sense of appropriateness vis-a-vis the Holocaust, right? So, there's a lot there. And then another thing that I've been thinking about, which goes in a little bit of a different direction. So in Ukraine, this is thinking about sort of maybe also how Jews think about Jewish history. So I noted, in 2022, when Russian attack on Ukraine happened, both myself and a lot of other Ashkenazi Jews that I know sort of, there's this moment of like mythologized home places suddenly became real because they were being bombed, right? And places that, maybe we never really felt particularly connected to, or maybe there was just this sense like, oh yeah, this is this place from this really, terrible past. But, going in like the span of about 2 weeks from sort of being like, yeah, Ukraine, I don't know, maybe kind of anti-Semitic, not sure, to being like, Slava Ukraini on Facebook, and just like the strangeness of like how did that happen? And I think that has really interesting, yeah, exactly, that's heritage, right? But sort of how those changes happen, because that has that affective quality. And those sort of mythologized ideas and those sensibilities of who we are vis-a-vis those places and those histories, they change in these moments, and they can change quickly, or they can open in a way that has, maybe potentially good effects for rethinking histories that have become heritage or memory.
I argued elsewhere that we shouldn't be prisoners to history, right? That we should be able to move beyond, so that people could say Slava Ukraine, not think about the past pogroms in that same way, or Christy, your work that you've been doing, and that Richmond doesn't have to be imprisoned in that capital, the Confederate States. So Annie, I have a question about this. It's kind of leading to these questions about limits, but also museums and the role they play and in both shaping the public understanding of history, as you were saying earlier, but also the responsibilities that come with that, right? And again, I think some of those themes have been addressed, but I wonder whether you could get us started on the theme of responsibility.
Sure. I think one thing I think about a lot, and I am not a psychologist, but there is something about good history that deals with psychology and letting people get past blockages they have. The story that you were telling about the nice old lady, or maybe not so nice, seemingly, right? But like 85-year-old lady who's telling the story, who all these years had never thought about that. I mean, it almost reminded me like she was almost, could that be like a psychological session, a therapy session? And you asked a question that opened her mind. It might have taken her a while to like soak that up, that allowed her to see something that she hadn't, because of so many of the politics of heritage and the way that the lies need to be reinforced over and over and over again, right? That there's this work that needs to be done. And I think there is a study done by a man named Marshall Duke, although he's at Emory University, a psychologist, who wanted to study students and wanted to understand what makes students resilient. And this was right after 9/11 had happened. So there was this kind of interesting moment of time to see how people were responding to what had happened. And all these studies done, what they found that the students who were most resilient were the ones who knew their family histories. And then the ones of those who were the most resilient of those were the ones that knew a family history that involved trouble, challenge, and oscillation. So if there was a student that was like, grandpa came and he worked hard, and then son, dad worked even harder, and then like things are great. Okay, that's one thing. But if there's someone that's like, grandpa came, he worked hard and all his life, but didn't do that well, but then things got a little bit better, and then uncle went to jail, that like those people, by virtue of the fact that they had a story to tell of that they're still there to tell the story, right? That and stories can be complicated. Those made the students the most resilient. So I think that when we think about public history, I think if we want to kind of expand that, those who know American history, not just the heritage stories, but know history in a multidimensional way that involves conversation, that involves uncovering different facets and different perspectives, that's how we get a healthier nation. So I again, there's a lot that goes into it, and that's a very simplistic way of thinking about it. But I don't think I think the field of psychology is really important here, and how we confront stories that a lot of times we have stories in our personal lives that we've needed to maintain to kind of understand something. And as you get older, right, and you guys are all, many of you, the students, are at the age where you're starting to be like, wait, maybe there was more to that story. Like that's the kind of work that needs to be encouraged. And then also public institutions need to do as well. So that's one way of thinking about responsibility. And there was something else that Christy was talking about too, with that idea of story. There's a great story that Barack Obama told. I think he was being interviewed like a week before he left office, right? So like he knew he was leaving office, and a journalist from the New York Times interviewed him about his favorite books and about reading. And he got to this point of like talking about when he was an activist in Chicago, and that he found that the way to effect change was not to show up at someone's house and say like, hey, we both want to preserve the environment, or we both want to do this. But the way that people bonded was the exchange of stories. And the act of listening to one another's stories allowed them to fight for a cause together, right? That was an essential part of it. And so I think this kind of exchange of stories and creating opportunities and context for people to exchange stories is also another responsibility.
So actually, I think this question will build a little bit on this, on the notion of responsibility. And this is for all of you. If you could sort of talk a little bit about the similarities and differences between the place of Jewish history and the Jewish experience in American life, and the place of Black history and the Black experience in American life. By American life, I mean in public history and public memory, but within the dominant societies that they're existing in.
I would say not just in terms of Jewish history, and not just in American life, but like Erica, your work in Poland, especially, and the place Jewish history and Jewish experience play in that kind of dominant culture. So I think the sort of
Let's start with you, Erica.
Oh, okay. I mean, what is the role that Jewish history and heritage plays like in Poland? I don't know, in some ways it's like a ghost, right? It's a ghost that kind of that haunts. But I think, I was thinking, because the way you started the question about in some ways comparing the way, what Jewish history and heritage means and how it sort of unfolds in a place like Poland, vis-a-vis a place like United States or North America. And I think one thing that's so interesting there is that for the most part, it unfolds and is engaged with and, celebrated and preserved or not, but without Jews, right? So it's almost entirely done by people who are not part of the community of which that history is about. And I think that's, for me, that's been a really fascinating domain to ask questions about cultural appropriation and allyship in ways that are a bit different, I think, from the ways that they get asked here, because it's absolutely essential. There is no way, like in Poland, you have, a community of, I don't know, let's say somewhere between 4,000 and 20,000 people, depending on how you count, who have, for example, inherited like the material, the leftover material infrastructure of 3.5 million Jewish people who were, murdered in the Holocaust, and then the last few of them kind of chased out in other ways. So it's impossible to manage that in any way. And this is something that Healy Weissman, when you have that talk, we'll talk about in much more detail. But that falls to the neighbors of those places. So there are synagogues and cemeteries and other monumental buildings that are falling apart. Some of them have been restored, but that work has to be done, and those places have to be cared for, and those places have to be somehow embraced as our own by the people who live there now, who are not Jewish. And so there have been, my first book was about heritage tourism, but also these kinds of engagements with Jewish heritage there on the part of non-Jews. And for me, it was in a slightly more optimistic time before this right-wing government, which I should say now very happily has been voted out just about a week ago. So we're back on track. But you know, I was immensely inspired and continue to be immensely inspired by non-Jewish Polish people who care for, do activism around, teach about, and embrace their neighbors' former places and that history, that story. So it's a kind of way I'm sort of really glad for that kind of cultural appropriation, if you want to call it that. And even the Jewish festivals that for, you know, the first 30 years of the Krakow Jewish Culture Festival, you know, it was like a festival run by non-Jews for non-Jews, to which Jewish performers and other people were invited. But you know, much more recently, there have been some young kind of you know, people with a younger, more politicized sensibility who have started they're like, well, why shouldn't some Jews have a Jewish festival, and like creating their own alternative festival. But these are things that I and a lot of people have felt immense gratitude for people doing that work. It was, for many years, it was a very progressive gesture in Poland for non-Jews to be performing, even, you know, even playing Jewish music, making Jewish food, et cetera, in the place of people who are not there to do it themselves. But of course, that kind of allyship, let's call it, even though that's not really the term, let's say that kind of stewardship, it has its flaws and its limitations. And of course, you have to ask what is lost when the people who's, you know, who built that culture are no longer there, and only in very small numbers now. And so I saw a lot of, you know, really cringy, sometimes offensive, and sometimes deeply, deeply problematic engagements with Jewish culture there, including by people who are very well intentioned. So I saw there was a learning curve, and then there was a certain point at which you kind of feel like, okay, people need to know better. A lot of dressing up as Jews, pasting on side locks, a lot of, you know, highly stereotypical kind of caricatured things, for the most part, most of which the people who were doing it thought that they were honoring Jews by doing this. So that's a major difference, and I think it's really interesting to, you know, talk about engagements with the culture of others across those kinds of boundaries.
Well, you know, to quickly say, so this question is about how the dominant societies is engaging the memory of a minority, right? And what you just said made me think about an experience a friend of mine who's Native American had walking into a museum, and she said, realizing that she is the artifact in that space. And I remember looking at a documentary about contemporary Jewish experience, young Jewish people in Poland, and how oftentimes in spaces, the awe at them being in the space, people who are sometimes well-intentioned, but surprised that they're even there. And there's this sense of like, you're an artifact of the past, and the person just realizing that they are the memory in real life. Yeah.
Of course, Erica's was the optimistic side of embracing it, but there's also the difficult side of the Jewish past and Jewish history being a burden for that dominant culture.
Yeah, I mean that's a whole other side of the story. But I mean, just maybe one term that these scholars, Elżbieta Janicka, came up with this really interesting term called philo-Semitic violence, right? So the sense of like how that kind of, you know, like freezing of like celebration of Jews, but in this kind of frozen, narrow sense of the way that you want it to be is really, you know, it can be another form of violence. So that's sort of the next wave over, you know, maybe our first generation of over optimistic, you know, gratitude.
It's interesting because you know, when you're thinking of Europe, you're saying that some of the young people saw it as, you know, that they are the artifact, right? The idea that they're not present. And when I think about the way that the predominant culture in the United States thinks about Jewish history and African American history and indigenous history, it's in waves. It's like Jews didn't exist here before Ellis Island. Is I think that the way that the dominant culture views this. And then we had this next wave of people that came after World War II, which is patently untrue. When I was working at Colonial Williamsburg, I mean, we made a point to specifically interpret Jews who were living in Williamsburg in the 1770s. There weren't many, but there were a few, and they were coming out of Portugal, Portuguese Jews. And we used them. We talked about those characters in that story arc to help our visitors understand why the founders put into place certain things, the rights of conscience, to be able to, the separation of religion, because these Jews were required to pay a tithe to the Anglican Church. They were not allowed to own land in Virginia, so they had to engage in commerce instead. There were all of these restrictions on what they do. You already know the restrictions on Black people. So in American consciousness, it's like there were the Indians, and then we came, and then we brought the Black people, and then we had some trouble. And then in the 1880s, then there was the potato thing happened, and then the Irish people showed up. And then, I mean, seriously, that's kind of how we process and that's the way it's been taught, right? And while I am delighted as well that Poland's political leadership has shifted from that sort of, and I love the phrase that you use when you said the shame history versus the pedagogy of pride. We're in that moment right now.
Yes.
That there are places and states in this country that want us to have a purely pedagogy of pride, right? If you can't, in my own state, it has recently been stated, oh my God, if we can't get people to love their state and their country, what are we doing? And I was like, well, it's kind of like your drunk uncle. You better figure out that he's an alcoholic first, so you don't continue to let that harm happen, right? You've got to address this stuff. And pretending, pushing it aside is really minimizing other people's experiences. At the end of the day, it's minimizing them as being unimportant. And you can't talk about Frederick Douglass and his brilliance if you don't talk about Frederick Douglass' escape from slavery and the horrible things that he endured, even as he made his way to be ambassador of Haiti. A country, by the way, the second nation in the Western Hemisphere to gain independence from a foreign power. And what did the United States do? Immediately shut them out. They are still paying reparations to France to this day, crippled a nation before it could even get off the ground because it was Black. And it wasn't that far away from the United States. So the concern of what could happen if our slaves get this idea. So it increased violence that was an already violent thing. So, I mean, this idea of violence to control is a really interesting thing. And then there's this really interesting dichotomy between the Black and Jewish communities themselves. And it is a dichotomy, right? That has its historical roots. Because there are Black people who will tell you our major and mainstream institutions were talking about the Holocaust before they talked about slavery, and we were here, right? This idea that, a place like Auschwitz could be commemorated or preserved to say never again, but we were holding weddings and are holding weddings on plantations and in slave quarters as if, and that there are people even, I will never forget, I mean, just recently happened where someone shared that they thought it was completely inappropriate to refer to plantations as work camps, right? As forced labor camps. You cannot, why would you call it that? I mean, they were a specific thing, it's appropriating. And my head exploded, but there is this thing. And then when we look at the modern civil, and also as people, explore this history, I mean, in the pre-Civil War era, particularly like, the two largest Jewish communities were not in New York. They were in Richmond and Charleston, and half of that population was slaveholding. And so that dichotomy in the relationships, and then you have the flip of allyship, in the 60s, right? Or Jews actually renting houses and facilities for Black families when nobody else would. So there's this interesting dynamic, you know, and I'm delighted to have been a part of this conversation, but I think that's another piece that as we explore these histories and these connections and intersections, that's the part that I think becomes so vital. The importance of studying the particular so that we can understand the whole, but not losing sight of the fact that there's a whole. If that does that make sense? You know, all of it is Americanness. It is, we're going to focus on this piece for a minute so that you can really understand how that played out in the larger community, or how the larger community narrative would impact this community in particular. I mean, those are the pieces, and that's why I think these two programs and the fact that you're doing this sort of intersectional piece is really quite impressive. So.
I mean, I'll just say that, I mean, one thing that gives me pause sometimes is that when you look at Jewish museums in the United States, so many of them are Holocaust museums, and the Holocaust did not take place in the United States, although there are important, you know, things to study around that time at the time. But I think there's a real gap in understanding American Jewish history as American Jewish history. And of course, they're related, all of that. But you know, there is something interesting about the Holocaust, that when you think about the Smithsonian and you think about the museums in Washington, D.C., that the museum, that's the Jewish museum, is a Holocaust museum. And I'm happy that it's there. It's an important, so important to study for world history, for humanity, for so many things. And there needs to be a place to understand, I think, American Jewish history more fully so that we understand what American history really is, and we can really fully understand group relationships and all of that and interactions. Yes, and that's right. There's a Jewish museum in Philadelphia that is American, you know, Jewish History Museum. Thank you, which is really interesting. Although my critique of that museum is a wonderful, marvelous museum. And because I'm a critical thinker, I'm supposed to do this, right? I think it's too happy. Like, I think it's too, like, there were challenges and triumphalists. We opportunities and freedom. And don't get me wrong, I do think the United States is the place where Jewish people have had the most opportunity. There's no question. And there are like fascinating moments in America. I would say that the moments of real learning can come from, like, you know, looking at the Rosenberg trial, like looking at really controversial moments that I think you're going to get pulled more into the vitality and interest in American history. I do think Black history is U.S. history. So it's in a different way than Jewish. It's not the same, right? To understand U.S. history, you have to know Black history. I think knowing Jewish history in the U.S. is helpful, interesting as another lens, but Black history is U.S. history, and you can't, and there's just really no way to say it other than that.
In Europe, that's the different story, right? In Europe, it's the same. Yeah. So we have a lot of interesting questions, and we'd love to hear, but we should open it up to you, especially the students, so we have time for conversation. So let's get this. Let's open it up.
Anyone?
Any questions? Any comments? Actually, comments not questions.
The students gets first dibs, but
Yeah.
everybody, you're also welcome. The public is welcome too.
She has a question right there.
Oh.
Front row.
Jack, you have it. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess, sure. I guess my interest, or first, thank you all for speaking. I think my big interest is how do you, or where do you see the line drawn between cultural appropriation and an honoring of culture? As you all you mentioned the festivals in Ukraine, they thought they were doing a good thing, bringing light to this culture. But where do you see a line in any practice of cultural appropriation or honoring it?
This is actually a question I wanted to ask you about how do we get it right?
Oh, yeah.
How do we get that history right?
Okay, well, that's a different, okay, so the question of cultural appropriation, I mean, there's no one answer. By the way, I was talking about Poland, not Ukraine, just to clarify, but there's not one answer, but I mean, a kind of litmus test, I think, is if someone who's from that group expresses displeasure with how they are being depicted and you don't care about that, that's a sign that you're probably doing something wrong. So yeah, I don't think that there's a clear line. I mean, the question of how you get it right in terms of like telling history, et cetera. I mean, I think it's really important to know that there is no one, like there's no way to get it right, because not because there aren't facts, but because, you know, these facts are always wrapped up in stories and emotions. I mean, and again, you know, going to current events because they're so on my mind. I mean, you see like new facts coming out right now about what's going on in Israel, Palestine, and they immediately get slotted already into a preformed story that, depending on what, you know, what story you have in your head. So it's like, it's not about the facts, right? It's about the story. I mean, the facts are very important. And I think about, you know, how to get, you know, how to sort of get closer to getting it right. I mean, it's sort of been brought up here about like, well, what should museums do? And I think, I mean, there are a couple of things that I would like them to do. One is to teach people about, you know, the difference between history, heritage, and memory, and to show that the work that they do is always political and always changing. And also, you know, when we're talking about these sort of difficult histories, history of slavery, history of the Holocaust, you know, I mean, in some way, all histories are difficult, but or have difficult parts. But I think, you know, and I'm going to, you know, kind of evoke a couple of different phrases from different scholars that I use a lot, but to try to not remain in what Edward Lilienthal calls the comfortable horrible, which is like, okay, there's a story, this was bad, things happened, we know, we cry, we feel sad. But instead to go to what educational theorist Deborah Britzman has called difficult knowledge, which is actually that knowledge that when you try to assimilate, it really shakes the frameworks, the stories, your sense of who you are, right? If you don't feel deeply challenged and really uncomfortable and have to really shift something in your perspective, then it's probably comfortable horrible.
Erica, unfortunately, the litmus test you were talking about, we're about to experience that in a week or so with regards to the Halloween. You know, Halloween is like that moment in which people just.
Thank you so much for the very inspiring conversation. I'm actually not a student here, and I probably have the least amount of involvement with this, thanks to Abby, I'm here today. I love that you talked about intersectionality, which is very important. And I'm in medicine and I study methylation. It's part of the research that we do. I just wanted to make this interesting observation. Since we're having this conversation, you said resilience is evolved from trauma, generational trauma. There is evidence currently that genes undergo methylation after birth. Your genetic material can be altered. And that process of methylation is passed down along generations. So maybe resilience is genetically encoded. Just a thought. From grandparent who's been through a famine. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I'll find it. It's okay. Thank you,
Thank you guys again for speaking. So I'm an undergrad senior and have recently discovered public history. For those of us who maybe want to go into a career for it or learn more about it, do you have any advice?
Don't take a unpaid internship.
No, and Fordham has a great like internship program thing that you can sign up for, and they've done a wonderful job of like connecting to cultural institutions, and it's a paid one. I'm sure. Yeah. With Laura Oricchio. Yeah. Okay. So, You
Yeah,
know,
Yeah, just figure out what you want to do. I
Yeah.
mean, whatever your specialization is, I can assure you there is a role for that in the museum world or where it's applicable.
and I think too, study exactly what you're interested in. And you might not be in a program that's called museum studies or public history, but study the content you're interested in. Don't worry if your dentist, like, you can't explain to your dentist what it is you do for a while. Like, that's okay. Take that pass. At the same time, because I had a dentist once and he's like, "What are you studying?" And I was like, "Ah." But at the same time, don't lose sight of the communities that you want to work with, or because that involvement in a community is going to help while you're studying your subject area, is going to help shape both in really interesting ways. Does that make sense? So, yeah.
I could maybe add one little thing onto this, which is, I mean, far be it from me to encourage anyone to like go to graduate school in the humanities and try to get an academic job. However, I was given really amazing advice when I was at the end of my PhD and not sure I wanted to go into the academy. And the director of the museum studies program that I was doing like as a certificate alongside my degree, basically, maybe because he saw how kind of thinky I was and everything, but said, you know, like, stay in the academy, and then from there you can consult with museums, you can like do curatorial projects, you can do all these other things, but you'll have this kind of stability. And there really is something to that. And I have to say, I mean, I didn't get to talk very much about my own work that I do, but I do these kind of crazy, wacky, like very provocative experiments in museums where the people in those museums could never do those things. I can do them because I'm outside, and if it fails, it's just data for me and I can write a paper about it. And so there's like, I mean, I think, you know, I don't know about the job market now sort of in museums and heritage. There's probably far, far more opportunities there than in the academy, but don't not go into the academy because you're really excited about doing public history. You can totally do public history from in the academy, and sometimes in really powerful ways and in lots of different kinds of ways. So.
Yeah. Hello. I'm an undergrad here at Fordham, and similar to Coleman's story, I also started in public history when I was, of course, in an unpaid internship at 18. But a question that I've had for a long time that I've, especially because I've mostly dealt with archives, is how do you present very troubling material that you come across and difficult histories without valorizing it, while still presenting it so that people know that it existed?
Probably a little over a decade, well, now 15 years ago, there was an exhibit here in New York at the New York Historical Society called Without Sanctuary. And this traveled around the country. These were postcard photography of lynchings of Black people. And these were created during that period as souvenirs. And people wrote notes on the back of them very casually about life. And there's a gentleman who had been collecting these. He was actually an antiques dealer, and he started finding them in like underneath the furniture or tucked in a hidden drawer, finding these things. They're a white guy, right? And so he started collecting them and realized how much more there were. But anyway, it's called Without Sanctuary. How do you deal with those difficult pieces of history like that? The body parts that have been found, that have been dried and taken from those lynchings. I mean, those are tough things to find in one's archives. And there has to be, so there's two parts to it. I'm at the Jamestown Yorktown Foundation now. And one of the things that, you know, we have made some ethical choices of late about how we will approach human remains and repatriating them to communities. And we're also having conversations about looted materials that are in our collections that need to be repatriated. We have not come across anything quite like, say, those photographs. But if we did, we would have to I would choose to exhibit them under very controlled circumstances. And when I say controlled, I mean controlled. With the Civil War exhibit that we did, there are some pieces there of images of emaciated people from the Civil War prisons that are naked. They're naked. There's some, and so we had to obscure them in some way for the younger viewer, but we had to tell that story as well. And so there are things like that. But I personally have now come to a point of view about human remains and body parts in museums. I do not think they belong there. I think that the honor of the dead need to be honored in the dead and reburied and things like that. So I don't know, but the nasty notes and letters, honey, I have read them, where every racial slur you can imagine has been used about someone. There's lots of material about that. There's a casualness to it that is just horrible. But it is in that casualness that we have to create an outrage. Remember when I said at the very beginning, building empathy involves a range of emotion. Empathy isn't just built off of, oh, this makes me feel good and I feel happy and a connection to this person. Empathy can actually be creating outrage around something. And so heat mapping, as the last thing I'm going to say, is a new technique that an exhibit designer that I worked with on the Civil War piece, it was another kind of innovation for us as an institution, was heat mapping our exhibits. And that was being very deliberate about where we had high emotional content, regardless of whether it was, make you cry, make you laugh. We actually mapped out in the exhibit where those moments were going to be, not as a secondary, but as a primary in understanding narrative arc and flow.
And that requires framing. I mean, and I think that's the thing. So I think almost anything, I agree with human remains, absolutely. But there's like really nothing you can find that should be hidden back in. It's more about what's the appropriate framing. Sometimes it's to say, you know what, this shouldn't just be in a case. This should be a class. There should be a conversation. There should be a led conversation about it. But I think, and to your point about empathy, like complexity and empathy go so well together. And so sometimes things are difficult because you see something of a side of someone that you want to view as heroic, but it's much better to understand the flaws that hero has, because then we understand the context in which that person develops. So mostly everything should be brought out.
I want to add something to that and maybe sort of challenge that approach, which I generally adhere to and I have long adhered to, but having done much more work like with Indigenous communities recently, I think there's the answer to that question in a way is there is no difficult subject matter out of context, because the thing is, what's so difficult, as Nisha said once, is like the difficult is not difficult for everyone, right? So what is difficult for somebody and not for somebody else. And so you can't heat map an exhibition. It's like, well, with whom are you heat mapping it, right? So who are you asking? And so in my work in Poland, like these, blatantly anti-Semitic masks were on the wall of this ethnographic museum for, decades even, in which I was complaining about them. But because there were no Jews going to that museum, it was like, okay, because and the question about hiding things away, I had that, I always call it like my Black Panther moment, like in that museum, but also with, Indigenous objects. I've really realized the objects themselves, they actually have the capacity to like do violence, right? They are like the experience for certain people of being in the presence of hateful things. It hurts. It is inflicting pain. It is continuing to do violence, or things that were stolen, right? Those are inflicting their violence as, and so there are real questions about ritual objects, about painful things for particular groups. Should everything just be shown? I don't think that, the question is who gets to decide that and who gets to suffer from those choices, right? And so I think there's just a lot that needs to be negotiated there.
And I would argue also with you on that particular point. And yes, I am absolutely clear on the not wanting to inflict additional violence. And that's where the framing comes from. But I would also argue if you have something in your collection that you cannot show or that belongs to somebody else, it doesn't belong to you anymore. I mean, you have to be active in that decision that if there is something that you have not had a conversation with that community about that thing, then you shouldn't show it. I mean, we at Jamestown, we do have a number of indigenous artifacts representing a variety of tribes, and the tribes do not always agree. The Chickahominy think it's fine. The Mattaponi don't want to see it. Okay, well, the Mattaponi piece, we're going to make sure you guys get that back, or you have control, or you tell us how that should be framed in those spaces. So it is a conversation. And heat mapping works because if you're doing your evaluation and your front ends, you find out who's coming, but you also find out who you want to come, and you find out how it's impacting them. And it's part of the reason why we made the decision, even though there were academics and hardcore who said, oh, that is so awful, you're mutilating the tradition, the historic image. And we made the decision to actually colorize some of the faces of Civil War actors. People that lived through the experience. Not everything. And we actually had a little panel that said how this was done, the way that we, the process that was used to colorize them based on our collections and pieces in our collection to make sure that we got them right based on the descriptions of these individuals. The reason why we did that was in our surveying of educators, K-12 educators, the teachers told us our students shut down when they see black and white without fail. They think it's old. They think it has nothing to do with them. So by showing a colorized image of a 10-year-old boy who was in the army as a drummer and who's dead on a battlefield has a very different effect when it's colored for that child. There were Chinese visitors to our museum who never knew that Chinese people participated in the American Civil War for the United States. And even though we had tons of images of these people, but they were sort of obscured in the black and white to a certain degree or behind somebody. And so when we were able to highlight them and bring them forward and colorize them, then it was like, holy cow, I had no idea, right? So that's part of so the mapping, the emotional mapping technique is bringing all of that data to the process. It's not just, so, I mean, the thing is, that's the beautiful thing. If you're a psychology major or sociology major, we need you in our field. Yeah. If you're a statistician, we need you in our field. I mean, it's because we're constantly exploring.
And designers,
and
visual design.
Chemists and, whatever your thing is, we got a thing.
So on that note, I invite you to dinner and thank you for joining us online and in person. And let's continue the conversation.